Shadows on the horizon. Emily Hart wiped a bead of sweat from her brow as she adjusted her wide-brimmed straw hat. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the fields of their farm, the gentle hum of cicadas the only break in the quiet. Life on the Hart farm was grueling, but Emily had learned to appreciate the hard work and the solitude it provided. Today, however, something gnawed at her, a strange unease she couldn't shake. Her husband, David, a retired Army Special Forces operative, was out running errands in town. Emily didn't mind being alone on the farm. She had grown accustomed to handling things when David wasn't around. She had always been fiercely independent, but the years alongside David had taught her resilience beyond anything she could have imagined. Yet, as she stood on the porch sipping her iced tea, the faint rumble of motorcycle engines in the distance pulled her from her thoughts. Her heart sank. The sound wasn't uncommon. After all, the open countryside often attracted groups of riders passing through. But something about this felt off. It was louder this time, more deliberate. The low, growling engines grew louder, breaking the tranquility of the farm. Emily set her glass down and stepped off the porch, her boots crunching against the gravel. As she squinted down the dusty road, the silhouettes of 5 motorcycles emerged over the hill. They were heading straight for her driveway. Emily's grip on her garden hoe tightened. The bikers weren't locals. She would have recognized their faces if they were. These men were strangers, and their arrival sent a chill down her spine. She told herself to remain calm. They might just be passing through. But the way they slowed as they approached the farm made her stomach churn. The lead biker, a tall man with a scar running across his jaw, pulled to a stop at the edge of the gravel road. The others followed, their engines idling. The man removed his helmet, revealing a rugged face framed by greasy black hair. He had the look of someone who thrived on intimidation. "Nice place you've got here," he called out, his voice carrying over the noise of the engines. Emily didn't respond. Her mind raced as she tried to read the situation. She could tell by their leather jackets, adorned with skull patches and flames, that they were part of a gang. Notorious or not, their presence alone was enough to unsettle her. "What do you want?" she finally asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. The man smirked. "Relax, lady. We're just admiring the view. Don't get many places like this in the city." The other bikers laughed, a low, mocking sound that grated on Emily's nerves. She stepped forward, positioning herself in front of the porch as if to shield the house behind her. "You've seen the view," she said firmly. "Now, why don't you move along?" The leader chuckled, exchanging glances with the others. "Feisty, aren't you? I like that." He dismounted his bike and began to walk toward her. "How about a cold drink for some weary travelers? Got any lemonade in that farmhouse of yours?" Emily's grip on the hoe tightened. She felt a tremor of fear, but refused to let it show. "This is private property," she said, her tone sharp. "You're not welcome here." The man's smirk faltered for a moment, but it quickly returned. He took another step forward, his boots kicking up dust. "What's the harm in a little hospitality? Don't tell me you're out here all alone." His eyes scanned the property, lingering on the barn and the house. "Or is the mister around?" "My husband will be back any minute," Emily replied without missing a beat. She wasn't about to let them think she was defenseless. The biker laughed again, this time more derisively. "Sure he will. And I'm the president." The others joined in, their jeers growing louder. Emily's jaw clenched as anger flared within her. She was no stranger to being underestimated, but this was different. These men weren't just mocking her, they were testing her. She could see it in their eyes, the way they lingered, waiting for her to falter. The man took another step closer, his tone turning more menacing. "Why don't you invite us in? We could use a little rest, maybe some of that lemonade." Emily met his gaze head-on, refusing to back down. "You're not setting foot on my property," she said coldly. "Now get back on your bikes and leave." For a moment, there was silence. The leader studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he grinned, a wolfish, predatory grin that sent a shiver down her spine. "I like you," he said. "Got some backbone. But let me tell you something, lady. Out here, backbone won't get you very far." Before Emily could respond, the sound of another engine rumbled in the distance. The bikers turned their heads as a rust-colored pickup truck appeared on the horizon, its speed kicking up a trail of dust behind it. Relief flooded Emily's chest as she recognized the truck immediately. David was home. The truck roared into the driveway, coming to a halt between Emily and the bikers. David stepped out, his tall frame and broad shoulders cutting an imposing figure. His boots hit the gravel with a crunch as he surveyed the scene. Though his face was calm, his sharp, steel-gray eyes missed nothing. "Everything all right here, Em?" he asked, his voice even but laced with an undertone of authority. Emily nodded, her grip on the hoe relaxing slightly. These men were just leaving. The leader of the bikers straightened, his grin returning, though it was less confident now. "You must be the husband," he said, his tone mocking. "We were just having a friendly chat with your wife." David's eyes locked onto the man's, unflinching. "Friendly chat, huh?" His voice was quiet but carried a weight that silenced the bikers' laughter. "Well, I'm here now, so why don't you finish your chat and move on?" The leader's smirk faltered. He looked David up and down, clearly trying to size him up. "And if we don't?" he asked, his tone challenging. David took a step forward, his posture relaxed, but exuding a quiet menace. "Then we've got a problem," he said simply. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. The leader hesitated, as if weighing his options. Finally, he let out a bark of laughter and turned back toward his bike. "All right, old man. We'll leave for now. But don't think this is over." David didn't respond. He stood his ground, watching silently as the bikers mounted their bikes and roared off down the road. Only when the sound of their engines faded did he turn to Emily. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Emily nodded, a shaky breath escaping her. "I'm fine. Just glad you're here." David's gaze lingered on the road, his jaw tight. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "And next time, they won't just be looking for trouble. They'll bring it." The quiet before the storm. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a fiery orange glow over the fields as David tightened his grip on the heavy toolbox he carried from the barn. The air between him and Emily was heavy with unspoken tension as they worked side by side, preparing for what they both knew would come. "They'll be back," David had said earlier, his voice steady but grim. Emily hadn't needed convincing. The look in the biker's eyes before they rode off had been enough to tell her this wasn't over. Emily stood at the edge of the porch, her gaze fixed on the winding gravel road that disappeared into the trees. She carried a rifle now, not because she wanted to use it, but because she needed to feel the reassurance of its weight. David hadn't questioned her decision. He knew her well enough to trust her instincts. It wasn't the first time they'd faced threats together, but this one felt different. More personal. David set the toolbox down on the porch steps and straightened, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "How long do you think we have?" Emily asked, her voice quiet. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he wiped the sweat from his brow and looked toward the barn, where the sun cast long shadows across the yard. "A few hours. Maybe less." His voice was calm, but Emily could sense the gears turning in his mind. David wasn't just her husband. He was a man who had faced the worst of humanity in combat. His calmness wasn't a lack of fear. It was the result of years of training and discipline. "They didn't just come here to intimidate us," he added, his tone sharpening. "They're looking to assert dominance. Make a statement." Emily nodded. She had seen enough in their eyes to know David was right. They were testing her resolve earlier, but next time, it would be more than words. "What do we do?" she asked, gripping the rifle tightly. "We can't just wait." David gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We prepare. And when they come back, We make sure they understand this is a fight they don't want. Fortifying the farm. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. David's military experience came to the forefront as he walked Emily through their preparations. They reinforced the barn doors and boarded up the house's lower windows. Emily worked alongside him without complaint, her hands blistering as she hammered nails into place. The sun dipped lower, painting the fields in deep crimson hues. In the barn, David gathered a series of tools and improvised weapons, things he had learned to create during his years in the service. He fashioned barricades using old planks and barbed wire, creating a choke point near the driveway. Emily watched him work, her admiration growing despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "Are we really going to need all this?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. David looked up from his work, his expression serious. "It's not about what we need," he said. "It's about making sure we're ready for anything." Emily swallowed hard and nodded. She trusted David implicitly, but the reality of the situation was daunting. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The bikers had the advantage in numbers, and they had nothing to lose. But Emily knew one thing they underestimated: her and David's determination. The calm before the storm. As twilight fell, the world grew eerily quiet. The cicadas that had filled the air with their hum seemed to retreat into silence, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Emily sat on the porch steps, the rifle resting across her knees. David stood beside her, his arms crossed as he stared into the distance. "Do you think we'll be able to stop them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David turned to her, his gaze steady. "It's not about stopping them," he said. "It's about showing them this isn't their playground. They think they can take what they want because no one stood up to them. But tonight, they'll learn." Emily looked at him, searching for any trace of doubt in his expression. She found none. David was a rock, unwavering even in the face of danger. His calmness gave her strength, and for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of hope. The sound of engines shattered the stillness. Emily's heart leaped into her throat as the unmistakable roar of motorcycles filled the air. David moved quickly, his posture shifting into one of alertness. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I'll take the first move." "No," Emily said, standing and gripping the rifle tightly. "I'm not hiding while you handle this alone." David hesitated, then gave her a nod. He had never been one to doubt her resolve. A reckoning at dusk. The bikers arrived in force. This time, there were more of them. 10, maybe 12. And they came with an air of confidence that sent a chill down Emily's spine. Their leader, the same man from earlier, rode at the front, his face twisted into a smug grin. "Well, well," he called out, dismounting his bike and spreading his arms theatrically. "Looks like the little farmer and her soldier boy decided to make a stand." David stepped forward, his eyes locked on the leader. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "You don't belong here." The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the farm. "I don't think you understand how this works, old man," he said, stepping closer. "This isn't your land anymore. It's ours." David didn't flinch. "You've made a mistake," he said simply. "Turn around now, and we'll forget this ever happened." The leader's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Or what? You gonna call the cops? By the time they get here, this place'll be ashes." Emily stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is our home," she said, her tone steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You think you can scare us, but you have no idea who you're dealing with." The leader's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Then he laughed again, shaking his head. "Feisty. I like that." He turned to his crew. "Boys, let's show them what happens when you mess with the wrong people." The bikers moved as one, their boots crunching against the gravel as they advanced. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, a remote trigger he had rigged to the barricade near the driveway. With a press of a button, a loud snap echoed through the air as the barbed wire sprang into place, cutting off their path. The bikers stopped, startled by the sudden barrier. David stepped forward, his voice low and commanding. "Last chance," he said. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." For a moment, it seemed as though they might listen. The tension hung thick in the air, the bikers exchanging uncertain glances, but the leader sneered, pulling a crowbar from his belt. "You think some wire's gonna stop us?" He spat. "We'll tear this place apart." He raised the crowbar, and in that instant, the calm shattered. The first strike. David moved like lightning. Before the leader could take another step, David had closed the distance, grabbing the crowbar and twisting it out of his hands. The biker staggered, caught off guard by the sudden burst of strength. Emily raised the rifle, her hand steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She didn't fire. She didn't need to. The sight of the barrel aimed directly at the group was enough to give them pause. "Enough," David's voice thundered, silencing the chaos. He stood tall, the crowbar in one hand as he stared down the group. "You've made your point. Now get off my land." The bikers hesitated, their bravado crumbling under the weight of David's presence. One by one, they backed away, mounting their bikes with muttered curses. The leader was the last to go, his eyes burning with fury as he climbed onto his motorcycle. "This isn't over," he growled. "You'll regret this." David didn't respond. He stood his ground, watching silently as the bikers roared away into the night, a line drawn in the dirt. The night settled over the farm like a heavy blanket, the silence almost oppressive after the bikers had roared off into the distance. Emily stood on the porch, the rifle still clutched tightly in her hands. Her knuckles were white, and her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. The adrenaline coursing through her veins made her jittery, and though the immediate danger was gone, her mind was racing with what might come next. David stood nearby, his broad shoulders outlined against the faint light spilling from the farmhouse. He didn't say anything, but his posture was tense, his hands resting on his hips as he stared down the driveway. His face was calm, but Emily could see the storm brewing behind his steel-gray eyes. "They'll come back," she said quietly, breaking the silence. David nodded, his gaze still fixed on the empty road. "Yes, they will," he replied. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a cold determination that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "And next time, they won't just be testing us. They'll come ready to make their point." Emily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the rifle. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. David turned to her, his expression softening slightly as he stepped closer. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll be ready," he said. "But this time, we're not just defending ourselves. We're sending a message." Emily's brow furrowed. "What kind of message?" David's jaw tightened. "One they won't forget. A call for reinforcements." As the hours passed, the weight of the situation settled over Emily like a dark cloud. She and David had spent years building their life together on the farm, pouring their blood, sweat, and tears into the land. The thought of losing it, of watching it be destroyed by a group of thugs, filled her with a deep, simmering anger. But anger alone wouldn't protect them. Inside the farmhouse, David sat at the kitchen table with a notepad in front of him. His pen moved quickly as he sketched out a rough map of the property, marking key points of entry and possible choke points. Emily watched him from across the room, her arms crossed over her chest. "Do you really think we can handle this alone?" she asked. David didn't look up. "We won't be alone," he said simply. He finished the sketch, then reached for his phone. Emily's eyes widened. "Who are you calling?" "An old friend," David said, dialing a number from memory. "Someone who knows a thing or two about situations like this." The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "David Hart," the voice said. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again." David smiled faintly. "Good to hear your voice, Tom. I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end. "What kind of favor?" Tom asked, his tone cautious but curious. David glanced at Emily, his expression serious. "The kind where a group of bikers thinks they can run roughshod over my farm and my family. I could use an extra set of hands, or two." Tom let out a low chuckle. "You always did have a way of finding trouble. Give me an hour. I'll bring the cavalry." David hung up and turned back to Emily. "Help's on the way." Emily felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the gnawing fear in her chest. "Who is he?" she asked. "Tom's an old army buddy," David said. "We served together overseas. If anyone knows how to handle a situation like this, it's him." The arrival. True to his word, Tom arrived just over an hour later, his old pickup truck rumbling up the driveway. The vehicle was loaded with supplies, duffel bags, crates, and a few things Emily didn't recognize, but suspected were far from ordinary farm tools. Tom was a bear of a man, tall and broad-shouldered with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He climbed out of the truck and extended a hand to David, a grin spreading across his face. "Still in one piece, I see," Tom said, his voice gruff but warm. "Barely," David replied, shaking his hand. "Glad you could make it." Tom glanced around the property, his keen eyes taking in every detail. "This the place?" he asked. David nodded. "This is home." Tom's grin faded, replaced by a serious expression. "All right then, let's get to work, setting the trap." With Tom's help, the preparations kicked into high gear. They worked through the night, fortifying the property and setting up defenses. Tom had brought more than just manpower. He had brought experience and ingenuity. Together, he and David rigged the driveway with makeshift traps designed to slow or disable the bikers' motorcycles. They reinforced the barn, turning it into a stronghold, and laid out a strategy for how to handle the inevitable confrontation. Emily worked alongside them, her fear gradually giving way to a sense of purpose. She wasn't just a farmer's wife anymore. She was part of the fight. As she hammered nails into a barricade, she felt a newfound strength rising within her. "They'll regret ever coming here," Tom said as they finished reinforcing the barn doors. He turned to Emily, his expression firm. "You've got grit, Mom. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Emily managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said, "but grit alone won't stop them." "No," Tom agreed, his eyes gleaming with determination. "But a good plan will." The night watch. By the time dawn began to break, the farm was a fortress. The three of them stood on the porch, surveying their handiwork. The traps were in place, the defenses were solid, and their strategy was clear. But the waiting was the hardest part. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the fields, Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The bikers would come. It was only a matter of when. And when they did, she knew there would be no turning back. David placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steadying. "No matter what happens," he said, "we stand together." Emily nodded, her jaw set with determination. Together. The silence stretched on, the minutes feeling like hours. And then, just as the morning mist began to lift, the sound they had been dreading filled the air. The low, growling rumble of motorcycles. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the rifle. Beside her, David and Tom exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. The moment they had been preparing for was here. The bikers appeared at the top of the hill, their numbers even larger than before. The leader rode at the front, his face twisted into a smug grin. He raised a hand, signaling his crew to stop at the edge of the driveway. "Well, well," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like the farmer called in reinforcements." David stepped forward, his stance unyielding. "You had your chance to leave," he said. "Now you're going to regret staying." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the fields. "Oh, I don't think so," he said. "This is our land now. And there's nothing you can do about it." David's expression didn't waver. We'll see about that. The reckoning. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of mist from the fields. Emily's heart thundered in her chest as the bikers sat at the edge of the driveway, engines growling like wild animals waiting to pounce. David and Tom stood a few steps ahead of her, their postures calm but alert. They were outnumbered, but the weight of their confidence seemed to tilt the balance in their favor. The leader of the bikers, the scar-faced man, dismounted his motorcycle and sauntered forward, his hands spread wide in mock friendliness. His grin was a predator's, sharp and full of malice. "Morning, folks," he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Lovely day for a chat, don't you think?" David didn't move. His sharp gaze locked onto the man. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. "You've got two options," David said, his voice low but carrying. "Turn around and leave, or stay and pay the price." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the fields. "Big words for a farmer," he sneered. "You think a few traps and your old army stories are gonna scare us off." David's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Try me." The leader's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it. He turned to his crew, gesturing for them to dismount. "All right, boys," he called out. "Let's show them what happens when you cross us." The bikers dismounted their bikes, pulling out chains, crowbars, and bats. Their movements were casual, almost lazy, but the menace was palpable. Emily tightened her grip on the rifle, her palms slick with sweat. Behind her, the house and barn were fortified, every window and door secured. It wasn't just their home, it was their last line of defense. The first move. David held up a hand, signaling for Emily to stay back. He and Tom stepped forward, their calmness a stark contrast to the biker's swagger. Tom carried a length of heavy pipe in one hand, the other resting on his hip. His eyes scanned the group with the precision of a seasoned soldier, cataloging their weapons and weaknesses. The leader stopped a few paces away, his smirk returning. "You gonna fight us with your little farm tools?" He taunted, twirling a crowbar in his hand. David didn't respond. Instead, he glanced at Tom, who gave a slight nod. The two men moved as one. David lunged forward, his fist connecting with the leader's jaw before the man could react. The force sent the biker staggering backward, his crowbar clattering to the ground. Before the others could process what had happened, Tom swung his pipe, taking out the knees of a burly man with a chain. Chaos erupted. The bikers surged forward, their earlier confidence replaced by anger. Emily stepped back, raising the rifle as the fight spilled into the yard. She had never fired a weapon at a person before, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her. But as she watched David and Tom fend off the attackers, she knew she couldn't hesitate if the time came. The traps are sprung. As the bikers charged, they triggered the first line of traps. The barbed wire David and Tom had rigged snapped into place, tangling around tires and boots. Two of the bikers fell, their screams cutting through the chaos as they struggled against the sharp metal. Another man tried to bypass the barricade, but his foot sank into a hidden ditch Emily and David had dug the night before. He cursed loudly, struggling to pull himself free, only to be met by Tom's swift strike with the pipe. The leader scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his split lip. He grabbed a bat from one of his men and advanced on David, swinging wildly. David ducked the first blow, his movements precise and controlled. He countered with a punch to the man's ribs, followed by a swift kick that sent him sprawling. "You're out of your league," David said coldly, his voice steady despite the chaos. The leader glared up at him, hatred burning in his eyes. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You don't know who you're messing with." David's response was a hard, calculated stare. "Neither do you." "Emily, stand." From her vantage point, Emily watched the fight unfold. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay focused. When one of the bikers broke away from the group and started toward the house, she stepped forward, blocking his path. "Move, lady," the man growled, brandishing a bat. You don't want to get hurt." Emily's heart pounded, but she stood her ground, the rifle steady in her hands. "I said, stop," she commanded, her voice firm. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking to the barrel of the rifle. For a moment, it seemed he might back down, but then he sneered, taking another step forward. Emily didn't wait. She fired a warning shot into the air, the sound cracking like thunder. The man froze, his eyes wide with shock. "I won't miss next time," she said, her voice cold and unyielding. The man dropped his bat and backed away, his hands raised. All right," he muttered. "I'm going." Emily watched him retreat, her hands shaking as the adrenaline coursed through her. She had never felt so powerful and so terrified. Turning the tide. The bikers' numbers were dwindling. Several of them lay groaning on the ground, tangled in barbed wire or nursing injuries from David and Tom's calculated strikes. The remaining men hesitated, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. "Fall back," the leader shouted, his voice hoarse. "Regroup." The bikers scrambled to their bikes, but their retreat was anything but orderly. David and Tom pursued them, ensuring they wouldn't have a chance to counterattack. Tom swung his pipe with practiced precision, smashing the engine of one bike and sending its rider sprawling. The leader mounted his bike, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he shouted, pointing a finger at David. "You'll pay for this." David didn't respond. He watched silently as the bikers roared away, their engines fading into the distance. Only when the last of them disappeared over the hill did he lower his fists, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Tom wiped a hand across his brow, his expression grim. "They'll be back," he said. David nodded. "Let them. They won't find us any less prepared." Aftermath. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the farm fell silent once more. Emily leaned against the porch railing, exhaustion washing over her. The yard was a mess. Barbed wire, broken tools, and patches of churned-up dirt bore testament to the battle that had unfolded. David approached her, his expression softening as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did good," he said. Emily managed a weak smile. "So did you." Tom joined them, his pipe resting on his shoulder. "They'll think twice before coming back," he said. "But we'd better be ready in case they do." David nodded. "We will be." As the three of them stood together, the weight of what they had accomplished began to sink in. They had defended their home, their land, and their way of life. But the fight wasn't over, not yet. Far off in the distance, the faint rumble of motorcycles echoed on the horizon, a reminder that the storm wasn't done brewing. The bikers' retaliation. The stillness of the farm after the fight was deceptive. The tension remained heavy in the air, like the charged calm before a thunderstorm. Emily, David, and Tom spent the afternoon repairing the damages, checking their defenses, and bracing for the inevitable. They all knew the bikers would return. Only this time, it wouldn't be a disorganized ambush. It would be war. The sun hung low on the horizon as David stood on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, surveying the land. Tom sat on an overturned crate nearby, sharpening a long, curved machete he had brought from his truck. Emily worked quietly in the kitchen, preparing a meal for them, though the weight of anticipation dulled her appetite. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the wind outside made her pause, her heart skipping a beat. David turned to Tom. "They won't come during the day," he said. "They'll wait until dark. They'll want the advantage of surprise." Tom nodded, his expression grim. "They know they can't match us in a straight fight, but that makes them more dangerous. Desperation can drive men to do stupid things." Emily emerged from the house with a tray of sandwiches and a pitcher of iced tea. "Eat something," she said firmly, setting the tray down on the crate. "You'll need your strength." David gave her a small smile, his eyes softening for a moment. "You've done enough, Em," he said. "You should get some rest." She shook her head, her jaw set with determination. "I'm not resting until this is over. We're in this together." a shadow in the dark. As night fell, the farm transformed into a labyrinth of shadows. The soft glow of the moon illuminated the fields, casting eerie silhouettes of the reinforced barn, the house, and the makeshift barricades. Emily stood at the window with the rifle in her hands, peering into the darkness. She had never felt so alert, every sound amplified in the silence. David and Tom were stationed outside, patrolling the perimeter with flashlights and weapons at the ready. They moved silently, their years of military training evident in their deliberate, measured movements. Emily could hear the faint crunch of gravel under their boots as they circled the property. And then it came, the sound they had been dreading. The low, guttural growl of motorcycle engines cut through the stillness like a blade. Emily's breath hitched as she strained to see through the dark. The noise grew louder, closer, until the faint glimmer of headlights appeared in the distance. The bikers were back, and this time they had brought reinforcements. The siege begins. The bikers rolled into view, their numbers nearly double what they had been before. At least 20 motorcycles roared down the gravel road, their riders whooping and hollering like predators circling prey. At the front was the scar-faced leader, his expression twisted with rage and determination. David and Tom stood their ground near the driveway, their silhouettes stark against the moonlit backdrop. Emily watched from the window, her grip tightening on the rifle as her heart pounded in her chest. The leader dismounted his bike, his boots crunching on the gravel as he stepped forward. His voice was loud and mocking, carrying across the distance. "Thought you could scare us off," he shouted. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't your land anymore. It's ours." David stepped forward, his posture calm but unyielding. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice steady. "Turn around and leave." The leader laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you tonight." He raised his hand, signaling to his men. "Take it all," he roared. The bikers surged forward, their motorcycles tearing across the fields toward the barn and the house. The air was filled with the roar of engines, the shouts of men, and the thunder of boots on dirt. But David, Tom, and Emily were ready, defending the farm. As the first wave of bikers reached the barricades, the traps were triggered. Barbed wire sprang up, tangling wheels, and sending motorcycles skidding to the ground. The bikers cursed and shouted as they scrambled to free themselves, only to be met by David and Tom. David swung a crowbar with precision, disarming one biker and knocking another to the ground. Tom, wielding his machete, moved like a whirlwind, taking out tires and felling men with calculated strikes. The bikers were strong and numerous, but David and Tom fought with the skill and discipline of soldiers who had faced far worse. Emily stayed inside, her rifle trained on the yard. When one of the bikers broke through the barricades and sprinted toward the house, she took a deep breath, steadied her aim, and fired. The shot hit the ground at his feet, sending him stumbling back. "I said, stay off my property," she shouted, her voice ringing with defiance. The man hesitated, then turned and fled. The barn burns. The leader, seeing his men falter, snarled with frustration. "If they want to fight for it, let's make it a fight," he shouted. He grabbed a torch from one of his men and hurled it toward the barn. The dry wood caught fire instantly, flames licking up the walls and casting a hellish glow over the battlefield. Emily gasped as the barn erupted into flames. "David!" she screamed, her voice breaking with panic. David turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw the blaze. "Tom, cover me," he shouted, sprinting toward the barn. Tom nodded, moving to intercept the bikers who were advancing on the house. Inside the barn, David worked quickly to free the animals. The horses whinnied in fear, their eyes wide with terror as he led them out one by one. The heat was suffocating, the smoke thick and choking, but David didn't stop until every animal was safe. The turning point. The fire raged, but the bikers' momentum was faltering. Their numbers were thinning as David and Tom's strategy took its toll. The traps, the barricades, and the sheer determination of their opponents had turned the tide of the battle. The leader, now visibly shaken, called out to his remaining men. "Fall back," he shouted. "Regroup." The bikers hesitated, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. One by one, they retreated, their motorcycles roaring back down the road. The leader was the last to go, his face a mask of fury as he glared at David. "This isn't over," he shouted. "You'll pay for this." David watched silently as the leader rode away, the flames of the barn casting long shadows across his face. He didn't respond. He simply turned back to Emily and Tom, his expression grim. Aftermath. The battle was over, but the cost was heavy. The barn was a smoldering ruin, and the fields were scarred with tire tracks and debris. Emily sat on the porch, her face streaked with soot and tears, the rifle resting across her lap. David joined her, lowering himself onto the steps with a weary sigh. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "We defended our home." David nodded, his hand resting on hers. "We did," he said, "but it's not over yet." Tom approached, his machete still in hand. "They'll be back," he said. "Not tonight, but soon. They'll regroup, and they'll come harder." David's jaw tightened. "Let them," he said. "We'll be ready." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the three of them sat in silence, their resolve hardening. The bikers had underestimated them once, but next time they would be prepared. The farm wasn't just a place. It was their life, their legacy. And they would defend it, no matter the cost. The final stand. The morning after the battle felt heavy, the air thick with the acrid scent of smoke from the burned barn. The once pristine fields were littered with debris, broken tools, shattered glass, and deep tire tracks. But it wasn't just the land that bore the scars of the previous night. Emily, David, and Tom were exhausted, their bodies aching from the hours of fighting and fortifying. They had won the skirmish, but the war wasn't over. Inside the house, Emily bandaged David's forearm, where a glancing blow from a crowbar had left a nasty cut. Her hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the lingering adrenaline and fear. "They'll come back," she said, her voice tight. It wasn't a question, it was a certainty. David nodded grimly. "And when they do, they won't hold back. Last night was a warning. Next time, they'll come to destroy everything." Tom leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. "They'll want to make an example of us," he said, "but they don't realize who they're dealing with." David glanced at Tom, then at Emily. "We can't just defend anymore," he said. "We have to go on the offensive." Emily looked up, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" David's eyes hardened. "We end this. Tonight. A plan to finish it." The three of them gathered around the kitchen table, the remnants of the map David had drawn the night before spread out before them. David used a pencil to mark key locations, roads, intersections, and choke points leading to and from the farm. "They'll come from this direction," he said, pointing to the winding gravel road that led to the main highway. "It's the only way they can bring their bikes and supplies. We'll set up an ambush here." Tom nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the map. "We can use the wreckage from last night. Block the road. Force them to funnel through one narrow path. They'll lose their speed advantage." Emily listened intently, her mind racing. "And what happens when they get through? They'll still have the numbers." David looked at her, his expression steady. "We won't let them get through." There was a beat of silence as the weight of his words sank in. Emily swallowed hard, then nodded. "What do you need me to do?" David smiled faintly, pride flickering in his eyes. "You'll be our eyes and ears. From the house, you'll have the best vantage point. If they break through, you signal us." Emily's grip on the edge of the table tightened, but she met his gaze without hesitation. "I can do that." Setting the trap. The hours leading up to the final confrontation were a blur of activity. David and Tom worked tirelessly, hauling debris from the barn. and using it to create a barricade at the mouth of the road. They'd rigged the blockade with improvised traps, oil slicks, nails, and tripwires designed to disorient and slow the bikers. Emily prepared the house, ensuring every window and door was fortified. She moved supplies to the attic, where she would take her position with the rifle. It was the highest point on the property, giving her a clear view of the road and the fields beyond. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them gathered in the yard, their silhouettes framed by the faint glow of the embers still smoldering in the barn. "This is it," David said, his voice low but resolute. "Whatever happens, we don't back down. We fight for our home, our lives, and each other." Emily nodded, her jaw set with determination. Tom gave a grunt of agreement, hefting his machete onto his shoulder. And then they waited. The return of the bikers. The sound of motorcycles pierced the night like a distant storm, growing louder with each passing second. Emily sat in the attic, her heart pounding as the headlights came into view. From her vantage point, she could see them clearly, more than 30 this time, their engines roaring like wild animals. David and Tom crouched behind the barricade, their faces set like stone. They didn't move as the bikers approached, their confidence evident in the way they rode, their leader at the front. The bikers slowed as they reached the barricade. The leader dismounted, his scared face twisted into a sneer. "You really think this little pile of junk is gonna stop us?" he called out, his voice carrying over the noise. David stood, his crowbar resting against his shoulder. "It's not the barricade you should be worried about," he said evenly. The leader's sneer faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Take it down," he barked at his men. As the bikers advanced, David pressed a button on a small remote in his hand. The ground beneath the barricade erupted in a flash of light and sound as the traps were triggered. Oil sprayed across the road, sending bikers skidding into each other. Nails punctured tires, and the chaos was immediate and devastating. Emily watched from above, her breath catching as the bikers scrambled to recover. She spotted one of them breaking away from the group, moving toward the house. She raised the rifle, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The final battle. The bikers who managed to get past the initial traps found themselves face to face with David and Tom. The two men fought like demons, their movements precise and ruthless. David wielded the crowbar with deadly efficiency, while Tom's machete cut through the chaos like a blade through grass. Emily fired from the attic, each shot carefully placed. She wasn't aiming to kill. She didn't need to. Her shots were enough to disarm and dissuade, forcing the bikers to retreat or take cover. The leader, furious and desperate, pushed through the chaos, heading straight for David. He swung a bat wildly, the force of his blows fueled by rage. David blocked the attack with the crowbar, the sound of metal on metal ringing out across the battlefield. "You should have stayed down," the leader snarled, his face inches from David's. David's expression didn't waver. "You should have stayed away." With a swift, calculated movement, David disarmed the leader, sending the bat clattering to the ground. He followed with a punch that sent the man sprawling. Tom appeared beside him, his machete at the ready, but David held up a hand. "Leave him," he said. "Let him tell the others." The leader glared up at them, his face bloodied and furious. "This isn't over," he spat. David stepped closer, his voice cold and unyielding. "Yes, it is." The aftermath. As dawn broke over the farm, the bikers were gone. The road was littered with abandoned bikes and scattered debris, but the farm still stood. Emily climbed down from the attic, her legs shaky, but her spirit unbroken. David met her in the yard, his face smudged with dirt and sweat. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," she said. Tom approached, his machete slung over his shoulder. "They won't be back," he said. "Not after this." David nodded, his gaze sweeping over the farm. "They underestimated us," he said, "but they won't make that mistake again." Emily stepped closer, taking David's hand in hers. "We protected our home," she said softly. "Together." And as the first light of morning bathed the farm in gold, they stood side by side, knowing they had won, not just the battle, but the right to keep what was theirs. The quiet that followed the bikers' retreat felt surreal. The once pristine farm bore the marks of the battle. A scorched barn, tire tracks gouging the dirt, and scattered tools and debris. Emily, David, and Tom stood in silence for a moment, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. But David's sharp gaze remained fixed on the road. "They're not all gone," he said, his voice low but certain. Emily frowned, peering out from the porch. "You think some stayed back?" Tom nodded grimly, his hands gripping his mashie. "They're regrouping, waiting for us to drop our guard." David turned to Emily. "Stay inside. Keep your rifle ready. If they make a move toward the house, you signal us." "I'm not hiding," Emily said, her jaw tightening. "You're not hiding," David replied evenly. "You're protecting the home. That's the most important job right now." Emily hesitated, but the look in David's eyes silenced any argument. She nodded, heading inside to take her position. From the attic, she scanned the property, her heart pounding as she tried to spot any movement. The counterattack. David and Tom didn't wait for the bikers to return. They moved quickly and silently, circling around the fields toward the road where the bikers had retreated. The two men moved like predators, their footsteps barely audible against the soft earth. They knew the terrain, every ditch and rise, and used it to their advantage. Through the faint light of dawn, they spotted the bikers. A smaller group, about 6 of them, had gathered near the edge of the property. Their motorcycles were hidden behind a thicket of trees, and they were crouched low, whispering among themselves. "They're planning another attack," Tom murmured. David nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Not if we hit first." The two men crept closer, staying low. Tom took out a small firecracker from his pocket, an improvised distraction he had rigged earlier. He lit it and tossed it into the trees behind the bikers. The loud bang sent the group scrambling, their heads whipping around toward the noise. David and Tom struck like lightning. David swung his crowbar with precision, taking out one biker before he could react. Tom's mashie cut through the air, slicing the fuel line of a nearby bike and sending gasoline spilling onto the ground. The remaining bikers shouted in confusion, their attempts to regroup thwarted by the sudden attack. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a knife, lunged at David. David dodged the strike and countered with a punch to the man's stomach, followed by a blow to the back of his head. The man crumpled to the ground. Tom faced 2 bikers at once, his mashie gleaming in the pale light. He swung low, forcing one man to leap back while delivering a powerful kick to the other's chest. The bikers were no match for the 2 men's discipline and coordination. Within minutes, the skirmish was over. The remaining bikers fled into the woods, abandoning their motorcycles and their wounded comrades. The leader's last move. The faint roar of an engine cut through the silence, drawing David and Tom's attention. From the shadows, the leader emerged, riding alone on a battered motorcycle. His face was twisted with rage, a makeshift Molotov cocktail in one hand. He sped toward the house, his intent clear. Emily, from her position in the attic, saw him first. Her heart seized as she realized what he was planning. "David," she shouted from the window, her voice urgent. "He's heading for the house." David and Tom sprinted across the field, but the leader was too fast. He threw the Molotov toward the porch, the flaming bottle arcing through the air. Emily reacted without thinking. She fired a single shot, shattering the bottle midair. Fire rained down harmlessly onto the gravel. The leader skidded to a stop, stunned. His hesitation was all David needed. He closed the distance in a few strides, pulling the man off his bike and slamming him to the ground. "This is your last chance," David said, his voice like ice. "Leave. Now." The leader coughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, but his defiance hadn't faded. "You think this is over?" He spat. You think you've won? David stared down at him, his grip tightening. We didn't just win. We ended this. Tom stepped forward, his meshi glinting in the sunlight. Your gang's gone. Your men have abandoned you. You've got nothing left. The leader's sneer faltered as he glanced around, realizing the truth. He was alone. Defeated. Go, David said, releasing his grip, and tell anyone who comes looking for trouble that this farm isn't theirs to take. The leader staggered to his feet, his eyes burning with anger and humiliation. He climbed back onto his bike and rode off, the roar of his engine fading into the distance. A new dawn. The farm was eerily quiet as the sun climbed higher into the sky. The smell of smoke and gasoline lingered in the air, but the sense of threat had lifted. Emily emerged from the house, her rifle still in hand, as David and Tom returned from the road. It's over, David said, his voice weary but firm. Emily's shoulders sagged with relief, tears welling in her eyes. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. We did it, she whispered. Tom leaned against the porch railing, wiping sweat from his brow. That was one hell of a fight, he said, a faint grin tugging at his lips. But I'd say it was worth it. David nodded, his gaze sweeping over the farm. The barn was gone, and the fields were damaged, but the heart of their home still stood. They had defended it, not just with their strength, but with their resolve. What now? Emily asked, her voice quiet. David took a deep breath, his hand resting on her shoulder. We rebuild, he said, stronger than before. Emily nodded, a flicker of determination lighting her eyes. She glanced at Tom, who gave her a reassuring nod. We'll help, Tom said. You're not alone in this. As the three of them stood together, the first rays of sunlight bathed the farm in gold. The scars of the battle remained, but so did the unyielding spirit of the people who called it home. They had faced the storm and emerged stronger. And no matter what came next, they knew one thing for certain. This land was theirs, and they would protect it, no matter the cost.